Okay, so here is a summary of the memory topic. So memory will be a 30-minute section, a 24-mark section in the end of year exam. It would normally sit in paper 1 in your final psychology exams. This is the spec. So if you notice, there are no names on the spec for memory. There are some key terms you need to know, and you need to know about research, but you do not need to know the specific names of any studies. So we start with what memories are. So you need to know that we've got different types of memories, and you need to know the difference between them. You also need to know what our memories are made of, and there is a video linked on the classroom for this. Cognitions or thoughts are kind of mental processes. They're made of engrams, which are memory traces. That's the picture on the right. So they're pretty much like fizzy, electrical Morse code type signals. So that's what memories are. That's what they are made of. Memory involves keeping, storing, and recovering information. So we look at the acquisition of information, we look at storage, and we look at the retrieval of information. So we look at encoding, we look at storage, and we look at retrieval. You could be asked about research into these features. So the first thing we'll look at is the multi-store model of memory. This is the model. So you have input via sensory register. You have information processed in short-term memory and then potentially moved on to long-term memory afterwards. You need to be able to describe the model, or at least draw and annotate a diagram of the model. There are 3 basic processes in memory, so coding, capacity, and duration. You might be asked to define these key terms. You might be asked for research into coding, capacity, or duration. So, for example, you could be asked a question which looks at the duration of long-term memory, and you could be asked to describe a study that looks at the duration of long-term memory. Now, again, there are no studies that are named on the specs. Any study you can use, you don't need to remember the name of it. So duration, capacity, and coding or encoding can be asked about separately. You could be asked about research into any of these 3 areas. And for example, if you're looking at research into, say, duration, there'll be research into duration of short-term memory, and there'll also be research into the duration of long-term memory. So coding or encoding is the way that information is stored or processed. Capacity is how much you can hold, and then duration is how long you can retain that information for. There's research into all 3 of these areas. So in terms of the sensory register, that's where information is encoded in the first place. So there's an experiment that looks at coding, capacity, and duration of the sensory register. So coding is modality or sense specific. Capacity of the sensory register is very large, but duration is very short. Short-term memory. Information is coded acoustically in short-term memory, so it's coded based on sound. And this is shown by Baddeley's experiment. So short-term memory is coded acoustically. The capacity of short-term memory was investigated by some experiments, including Jacobs' experiment, and found that the capacity is small. It's between kind of 5 and 9 items. So that's your capacity. You can increase capacity by using chunking. And the duration of short-term memory was investigated by the trigram experiment. And they are looking at the duration of short-term memory. Again, you don't need to remember the names of these researchers, but you do need to have an example of research into capacity, coding, and duration. Peterson and Peterson found that the duration of short-term memory is short, so between 18 and 30 seconds. Long-term memory, so that is coded semantically. So long-term memory is coded based on meaning. The video on the Brain Dictionary that's linked on the classroom is helpful to look at how coding occurs in long-term memory. The capacity of long-term memory is unlimited or infinite, and it's difficult to test. but we assume that it is infinite. And the duration of long-term memory is good as well. Again, there's research here. You don't need to know the name. You need to know what they found. The yearbook study found that duration is good. It lasts a lifetime as long as we have cues to help access our information. So this is a summary of the research into coding capacity and duration for the sensory register, short-term memory and long-term memory. Again, the names aren't important as long as you know what research was carried out and kind of what the research found, and the findings are here in the table. So that was our multi-store model. It's known as a multi-store model because you've got different stores. You might be asked to describe the model, so that could be an A01 question, and you would use the information that's on the screen, or you could do a very detailed annotated diagram of the model. You might be asked to evaluate the model, so there's lots of evidence that supports and challenges the model. Clive Waring is a good example. Again, there's a video of Clive linked on the classroom. You could also look at kind of alternative research as well. Reductionism is a good debate to use when you are evaluating the multi-store model. It's been described as too simplistic. The second memory model is the working memory model. It looks like this. So the working memory model is an active model of memory. We had a guest lecture on working memory, and that is also linked on the classroom. The working memory model was investigated by Badley, and again, Badley's video is on the classroom for you to look at. So you've got different parts of the working memory model. So you've got the central executive, which is in charge of kind of the system and restricts conscious awareness to kind of 2 items, one from each of the subsections, and acts as a filter for information. The phonological loop is your inner ear and your inner voice. So it deals with spoken and written material. It's kind of a temporary acoustic store. You've got your visual spatial sketchpad, the inner eye and the visual cache, which looks at kind of written information. And you've got the episodic buffer, which is kind of helps integrate information from the different stores. So that is your working memory model. There is evidence to support and challenge the working memory model. So Badley and Hitch's dual task experiments support the working memory model. KF can be used to support the working memory model as well. You can also look at evidence from PET scans. Reductionism is an issue in debate you can use for this as well. Then we need to look at long-term memory and the different types of long-term memory. So there are 3 types of long-term memory, so episodic, semantic, and procedural. Episodic memory is our memory of events. Semantic memory is facts and kind of general knowledge information. And procedural memory is the memory of how to do things. There is evidence to support the existence of the 3 different types of memory. They seem to activate different areas of the brain. You can also use Clive Waring again to support the idea that there are different types of long-term memory. And Henry, so you can use HM for that as well. Reductionism again can be used as an issue in debate when looking at the types of long-term memory. Then we need to look at forgetting. So we've looked at remembering, and now we need to look at forgetting. So that is about interference and cues. So when we look at forgetting, we're looking at availability or accessibility. You know, have we lost information, or is it just that we cannot access information? Interference is where we have one memory disturbing the ability to recall another memory. This is more likely if memories are similar, so that's interference. We've got 2 types of interference. proactive and retroactive interference. Interference is a very common exam question. You need to make sure that you know the difference between proactive and retroactive interference. So hopefully the diagrams and the explanations will help. But it's a really common question from AQA looking at interference and the differences between the types of interference. You have research to support and to look at different types of interference as well. So Underwood and Postman, and you've got Badley and Hitch as well, looking at interference. In terms of evaluation, so evaluation from interference, most research comes from lab studies. You can evaluate the methodology, and you can look at the lack of motivation and the artificial nature of the tasks. Then we need to look at retrieval failure. So it's not about the availability of information, it's about the accessibility of it, whether we're just lacking the appropriate cues to recall information. There's something called the encoding specificity principle, which says that you need a cue which will increase the likelihood of recall. And we look at cues in terms of context and also state. So cue-dependent forgetting is looking at retrieval failure and looking at how cues can help us recall information. So these can be context cues, so external cues, and also cues about the mental state we're in. So these are internal cues. So we can look at context and state-dependent forgetting. Godden and Badley, the diver study, looked at context-dependent forgetting. And remember, no names on the spec, you just need to know what they did. State-dependent forgetting is about the mood you are in. So there's a study on antihistamines, and there's also kind of a study on whether people are sober or drunk when they are recalling information. So it's about your mood and having a cue from kind of the state that you are in. There's research to support the importance of cues. It also has a good real-life application. However, retrieval cues do not always work. Then a bit of a recap from the cognitive approach about schema theory. So remember, schemas are frameworks, expectations that help us understand the world. They help us interpret information and fill any gaps in our knowledge, but they can distort our recall because they are based on assumptions and stereotypes. You can see schema theory in action through the War of the Ghost story from the cognitive approach. And what can happen over time is that it will alter the information that we can recall. Now, this is relevant in terms of eyewitness testimony. So we need to look at eyewitness testimony, and we need to look at what can affect people's eyewitness testimony. So some key terms here, you've got leading questions, so questions that make it likely that someone might change their answer in a certain situation. Misleading information, so giving incorrect information that might change people's responses. And then post-event discussion, so talking to someone after an event that again might change your memory. And all of these can be linked to schemas and how our schemas can affect our recall. You've got the study by Loftus and Palmer, so the car crash study that looks at leading questions and the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. So remember the change in the verb changed people's estimate of the speed, indicating that people's memories could be distorted through certain words in the question. So leading questions can affect memory. They also looked at misleading information and found that that can also affect people's memories. So factors that can affect the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, you've got misleading information, you've got that study, Bugs Bunny in Disneyland, which there is a video to on the classroom if you want to remind yourself about that. You've also got a real-life example through Yule and Cutzel's research that you can use as well. Reductionism is an issue in debate that you can use again in terms of accuracy of eyewitness testimony, and this paragraph just kind of demonstrates how you might use it. Then we need to look at anxiety and how anxiety can affect the accuracy of eyewitness testimony. You can use the Yerkes-Dodson curve here to say that increased anxiety can reduce accuracy of eyewitness testimony. And then you've got the Johnson and Scott study that you can use to support this as well. And then we look at improving the accuracy of eyewitness testimony, which is the cognitive interview. So the cognitive interview is a police technique for interviewing witnesses that recreates a context. So we're using the information in terms of retrieval and to try to enhance people's recollection of an event. The cognitive interview has 4 steps or 4 techniques that can be used. So report everything, reinstatement of context, reversing the order, and changing perspective. If you can find some way to remember those parts or some kind of mnemonic to remember them, that would be helpful. It doesn't really matter what order they're in, but it's just the 4 components of cognitive interview are important. And you should be able to name them. You should also be able to describe what each stage involves. You can be asked about cognitive interviewing questions such as this, where you might be given a STEM and you might be asked to refer to that STEM when you're talking about the cognitive interview. If you get a question like this, please make sure you refer to the STEM and please make sure you read the question carefully. For example, this question is asking how it would help recall. You need to make sure in your answer you are saying how recall could be enhanced through the cognitive interview. You've also got the enhanced cognitive interview, which is kind of just a further development of the cognitive interview, other things that you could do to enhance people's recall. You could be asked to compare the standard interview to the cognitive interview, and the information on the screen is the standard interview, and then there's a section in your booklet where you can compare it to the cognitive interview. You've got research that looks at the use of the cognitive interview, and that can be used as your AO3 if you have a longer question. There's also criticisms of the effectiveness of the cognitive interview, the fact that it sometimes enhances a quantity of information without perhaps affecting the quality of information. So that is the memory topic. Remember, again, use your booklet, use your textbook, use Caboodle to make sure that you understand everything and you don't have any gaps in your knowledge.